Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Severed. Now, Severed is a graphic novel written by Scott Snyder and Scott Tuft and illustrated by Attila Futaki and published by Image Comics. Now, this was published in 2013, and it was first published as a 7-issue comic book series, but later on those 7 issues were all put together in the form of one graphic novel. Now, I'm not that familiar with Scott Tuft, but I believe he's actually a filmmaker, and I don't think prior to this he's written anything in terms of books or comics, but I do know that he's a longtime friend of Scott Snyder. Now, Scott Snyder I am very familiar with. Now, I haven't read everything from Scott Snyder, but out of what I have read from him, I can honestly say that I am a pretty big fan of this man's work. Now, Scott Snyder also writes the ongoing comic book series American Vampire, which the first few issues of American Vampire were actually co-written by Stephen King. Now, Scott Snyder has also written a graphic novel called The Wake, which I actually reviewed almost a year ago now, and he's also written several Batman comics. Like, Scott Snyder has written many of the Batman comics of the New 52 era, and prior to the New 52, he wrote an excellent Batman story arc called The Black Mirror. But once again, I am actually a pretty big Scott Snyder fan, even though I haven't read everything from him yet. Now, the plot of Severed is it's set in the year 1916, and it follows this 12-year-old boy named Jack, who actually finds out that he was adopted. So one night he actually runs away from home in search of his biological father, and as the story goes on, he ends up meeting this old man, and this old man offers him friendship, but you as the reader realize that this old man is not who or what he says he is, and as the story goes on, it becomes apparent that this old man is actually some kind of a supernatural creature, and that's all I want to say about the plotline of Severed. Now, Severed was an excellent book, and I would highly recommend this book if you're a fan of horror comics or horror graphic novels, and I also recommend this book if you're a fan of coming-of-age stories, because this book is very much a really dark coming-of-age story. Now, I'm a sucker for coming-of-age stories, so this book was right up my alley in that regard, and once again, it's a really, really dark coming-of-age tale. And this really is kind of a story about the loss of innocence, and it's a story about hopes and dreams really kind of crashing and burning, and the main villain of this story, he feeds on false hopes. He feeds on false hopes in order to lure children into his traps, and he feeds on Jack's false hopes in this story. So once again, it's a story about false hope and a story about the loss of innocence. And you could also look at the main villain of this story as kind of representing the death of the American dream, because for the longest time in America, there's been this, like, really optimistic belief that you could go out and be what you want to be and do anything, and Jack, the main character of this story, wants to be a fiddle player with his father, and he thinks he's gonna go out and find his father and live happily ever after, kind of live the American dream, and the main villain of the story, the old man, really kind of represents the death of all of that. But yeah, once again, Severed is an excellent book, and I really liked the characters in this book. Like, you have the character of Jack, who is a pretty likable protagonist, even though he is a little naive in the story, but that kind of adds to what the themes of the story story are, and also, he is only 12 years old, and you also, in this book, have a character named Sam, who is a girl that Jack befriends in the story, and Sam was a freaking awesome character, and she really becomes kind of like the voice of reason for Jack, and she, right off the bat, sees right through this old man's bullshit, and realizes that this old man is a scumbag. And the main villain of this story is such an evil, evil character. And in the story, once again, it does become apparent that he is some kind of a supernatural being, but you never really find out what exactly this old man is. You don't know if he's some kind of a demon or a vampire or something. Like, it never really tells you what he is or where he came from, but minus the fact that he's a supernatural creature, when you break it down, he's also a child murderer. Like, essentially that's what he is, and you have child murderers in real life, and this character kind of represents all that, and once again, he's just such an evil, evil character. And Attila Futaki's artwork in this book is actually really well done, and the book takes place in 1916, and his artwork really does reflect and capture the time period that this story takes place in, and I also got a real Scott Hampton vibe from his artwork. Like, his artwork in this comic really did remind me a lot of Scott Hampton's artwork. But yeah, that was my review on Severed by Scott Snyder and Scott Tuft, and if you haven't read this, I would definitely recommend it, and bye.